Over the years, my wife has made a concentrated effort to help me better identify whatever emotions I might be feeling in a particular moment. Ironically, I don't ever remember her asking me how I felt about understanding my feelings, but she knows that my go-to response is usually going to be one word: fine. I'm fine. Fine tends to be my go-to answer when describing how I feel about anything. And not to be defensive, but I don't think I'm the only person of my gender who uses the word fine as an umbrella term for all kinds of unknown and unrecognized feelings. My spectrum of emotions ranges between fine, good, and meh. That's about it. To help me better identify my emotions, my wife has this tool she uses that she calls the wheel of emotions. And for a period of time, the wheel of emotions hung on our refrigerator at home as a way to help our whole family navigate whatever feelings we might have in a given moment. And so this wheel gives you dozens of options when it comes to identifying how you feel. So instead of just saying, I feel angry, the wheel might help you recognize that you actually feel more disrespected or you feel more withdrawn. But the idea is that you can identify whatever emotion you're feeling in a moment, and by identifying it, you can better understand where it's coming from, and you can also better navigate where it's inevitably going to take you and the people around you. And so over the years, here's what I've discovered as a pastor, and I've also learned of this personally. There are some common emotions that tend to show up when your way isn't working. When you're not living your life deeply connected to Jesus, there are some feelings that begin to surface. Let's go back to our controlling metaphor in John 15, verse 5, where Jesus says, "I am the vine and you are the branches." When I'm doing things my way, I've stopped being the branch and I'm trying to be the vine. In other words, I'm trying to live my life out of my own strength and wisdom. I'm trying to bear fruit from my own efforts. Instead of connecting to Jesus and finding what I need in Him, I'm trying to find that in myself. And this approach will eventually not work. When that happens, you just start to find these predictable emotions forming. And so I want to draw your attention to 4 emotions that often show up when you're living this disconnected life. But before we do that, I want us to identify one of the disciples who I think could have used the feelings wheel in his life. Peter was a guy who was pretty emotional, but wasn't always good at identifying and navigating his emotions. So when we meet Peter, he's making a living as a fisherman. And in Luke chapter 5, we read about this moment in his life when it's really obvious that his way isn't working. In Luke chapter 5, Peter's not yet been called to become one of the 12 disciples, but he's been around Jesus enough to know that Jesus is an incredible teacher. Peter and his crew have pulled their 2 boats up to the shore and are washing their nets after they've been fishing all night long. They've been on the Sea of Galilee trying to catch something. They're exhausted. They're ready to go home for the day. But Jesus has other plans. Verse 3 tells us that Jesus got in one of the boats. It doesn't appear that Jesus asked. He just climbs into the boat belonging to Peter. I don't think Jesus is being presumptuous here because Jesus had recently healed Peter's mother-in-law. So Peter owes him one, I guess, depending on how he felt about his mother-in-law. So Jesus has Peter take him out on the boat just a little bit so that the natural acoustics of the water will allow him to communicate to a large crowd. And verse 4 tells us that when Jesus finished speaking, he said to Peter, "Now let's go out to where it's deeper and let down your nets to catch some fish." Okay, Jesus. Peter's a professional fisherman. He's been out all night fishing, and now you're telling him to go back out and try again. Peter must have been thinking, "Hey, Jesus, I'll leave the teaching to you. You leave the fishing to me. How about you stay in your lane?" What he actually says, though, to Jesus is, "Master, we've worked hard all night, and we haven't caught anything." If my wife would have been on the boat, this is where she would have pulled out the wheel of emotions and asked Peter to use his feeling words. Peter lets Jesus know that he has already tried. He's worked hard. He's got nothing to show for it. He said, we haven't caught anything. Peter acknowledges, in other words, that his way isn't working. But it's not because of a lack of effort. They've been fishing all night. And my guess is you've experienced this dynamic in your life. Maybe you're experiencing it in real time. You've put in the work, expecting to produce a certain result, but despite all of your efforts, you just don't have much to show for it. You've tried hard maybe to turn things around as a parent. You've made an effort. You've tried to be more consistent with your child. You've been intentional to communicate your expectations. You've worked on responding instead of reacting, but you don't have much to show for it. Or you've put in long hours at work. You've taken the initiative. You've made extra efforts. You've asked your boss, what else can you do to improve? And you've implemented the suggestions, but every time there's an opportunity for a promotion, you get passed over. Or maybe you've tried to reconnect with a sibling, and from your perspective, you're the only one who's trying, but the more work you put into it, the more indifferent they seem. Or you've worked hard on your marriage, like you've read the books and you've listened to podcasts and you've even attended a conference and gone to a counselor. You've learned your spouse's love language only to discover that apparently they're bilingual. And so despite your best efforts, nothing seems to change. In fact, things seem worse. So let's talk about the emotions that show up when this is where we find ourselves, when our way isn't working. There are 4 feelings, and sometimes these feelings are progressive in nature. One emotion leads to another. Other times, they like to team up and come at us all at once. But when you're consistently experiencing some kind of combination of these emotions, it's almost a sure thing that your way isn't working. You need to do something different. So imagine the dashboard of a car that has a number of gauges that indicate the health of your vehicle and let you know what might need some attention. I'll give you an emotion and define it, and you think about that as a gauge for your life. And then I'll use that emotion in a sentence so we can have an example of it. So the first emotion would be discouragement. Definition of discouragement would be a loss of confidence and enthusiasm. Here's the sentence. When nothing changed between the mother and her teenage daughter, the mother struggled not to give in to discouragement. A second emotion would be fatigue. Definition of fatigue, extreme physical and mental tiredness that comes from a prolonged period of concentrated exertion. He started off strong, but his pace wasn't sustainable, and fatigue set in. Here's a third emotion, frustration. Definition of frustration would be upset or annoyed, especially because of an inability to change or achieve something. When she didn't respond the way he expected her to, he slammed the door in frustration. One more feeling that tends to come when your way isn't working, anxiety. It's a feeling of worry or unease, typically when facing an imminent event or an uncertain outcome that you have no control over. Here's the sentence. The 5-year plan for his new business was turned upside down by an unexpected pandemic, and it left him feeling overwhelmed with anxiety. When your way isn't working, you'll notice some combination of discouragement, fatigue, frustration, and anxiety. And maybe you're thinking, well, look, I almost always feel that way. Okay, you said it, not me, right? Or maybe you don't think any of those emotions describe you, but I wonder if some of the people around you might disagree. So how do these emotions show up on the dashboard of your life? You can expect some combination of these feelings when your way isn't working, when you're not connected to the branch. So if you're feeling a little bit discouraged or tired or frustrated or anxious, how do you respond? Well, let's look at Peter's response in Luke chapter 5, Peter's way isn't working. He knows that. And Jesus tells Peter he wants him to do the same thing he's been doing, with one exception. This time, Jesus is going to be in the boat. Peter's been fishing all night. He hasn't caught anything. When he expresses to Jesus the reality of his situation, he probably hoped for a little bit of encouragement, understanding. When our way isn't working, when we're not seeing the desired results, that's what we want from the people around us. We want them to say things like, hey, you tried your best, give you an A for effort. Maybe next time things will work out. Peter waits in silence, though, for Jesus to change his mind about going back out and casting his nets. But when that doesn't happen, Peter gives the only response that is the right response when your way isn't working. Peter says to Jesus, because you say so, we'll let down the nets. Peter says, because you say so. He's going to obey and do things Jesus' way, even though he doesn't feel like it. What Jesus asks of Peter didn't make any sense to him. Peter was using the same boats, the same nets, the same lake. If anything, the conditions for fishing were worse, and Jesus tells Peter to go back out into the deep water. This time it's in the heat of the morning. None of the fishing books would tell you that these are fishing best practices. But Peter's response is, because you say so. It doesn't make sense to me, but because you say so. I've tried it again and again my way, but because you say so. People will think I don't know what I'm doing, but because you say so. I'm tired and I'm worn out, but because you say so. I really don't think this is going to work. I don't really feel like doing it, but because you say so. Saying that, it's difficult, especially when it's different than what you want to do or what you think will work. It requires something that none of us do very naturally. It requires humble submission. Peter doesn't get a reason or an explanation. He doesn't get a guarantee. I mean, that's how most of us would want this story to go, that Jesus would say to Peter, hey, buddy, I know you're tired. I know you've been working all night. I know you guys are exhausted. I get it. You just cleaned the nets and put them away. I know you don't want to do what I'm asking you to do. But if you'll take me out there into the deep and throw your nets out again, here's what I'm going to do for you. I'm going to cause your boats to overflow with fish. I'm going to cause there to be so many fish, it'll tear your nets. If you'll humble yourself and submit to me, here's what I'm going to do for you. But that's not what happens. There's no guarantees. In John 15, Jesus promises us that apart from him, we can't do anything. But if we're the branch and we stay connected to him, that will bear much fruit. I don't know what that looks like. I don't know what kind of production you can expect. There are no specifics that are given, no guarantees that are offered. Peter has stayed up all night. This time he goes back out. What's different about this time is this time Jesus is in his boat. And Peter's about ready to get a front row seat to see that more than his efforts, more than his expertise, it's the connection to Jesus that leads to production. So how does Peter respond? That's the same way that we need to respond. He humbles himself. He goes back out on the water, but this time Jesus is with him. He casts his nets out. Verse 8 tells us, so when Peter saw all of this, he fell at Jesus' feet and said, go away from me, Lord, for I'm a sinful man. So picture the scene. Peter falls at the feet of Jesus in the boat. What's he surrounded by? Well, flopping all around him is evidence that with Jesus, he could do what he could never have done on his own. Unconnected to Jesus, he couldn't do anything, but connected to him, he could bear much fruit. So what I'm saying is, if you're feeling a little bit discouraged, a little bit frustrated, a little tired and anxious, I get it. Make sure Jesus is in your boat.